Sydney on the evening of October 25th, 2023, was doing what Sydney does best in the weeks before summer fully arrives. The harbour caught the last of the light and scattered it across the water. Families sat on back decks with cold drinks already sweating in the heat. Office workers stepped out of air-conditioned buildings and into the kind of warmth that makes you slow down, even if only for a moment. The city moved in its usual unhurried Wednesday rhythm. Commuters packed onto trains. Kids in school uniforms made their way home from afternoon sport. Somewhere in the CBD, water polo training was wrapping up for the evening at one of Sydney's most prestigious private schools. At 7:09 in the evening, a surveillance camera inside the corridor of that school captured a young woman walking through the building. She was 21 years old. She had her whole life mapped out ahead of her, and she was smiling. Her name was Lilie James. Within 2 minutes of that footage being recorded, she was dead. There is a question that sits at the center of every story like this one, and it is not the question you might expect. It is not who did it. That answer came quickly. It is not even how. The how is documented in evidence, in CCTV footage, in a police investigation that moved with rare speed and precision from the moment her body was found. The real question is this: have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover, far too late, that the version of themselves they allowed you to see was carefully constructed? That behind the easy smile and the steady eye contact and the well-chosen words, there was something else entirely. Something that had been there from the very beginning, watching, calculating, and waiting for the moment you became inconvenient. Most people will say yes to some version of that question. Most people will also say they did not see it coming. Lilie James did not see it coming either. She was not naive, she was not reckless. She was in a 5-week relationship that she ended clearly, calmly, and with every confidence that it was finished. That decision, the single, ordinary, entirely human decision to walk away from someone who was not right for her, was the last free decision she ever made. This is her story, and it begins the only way it should, with her. Before we go any further, if you are watching this for the first time, welcome to Bedtime Black Files Stories. If you have been here before, you already know what this channel is about. Real stories, told with the respect and the depth they deserve. Take a moment right now to hit the like button, because it genuinely helps more people find stories like Lilie's. Subscribe if you have not already, so you never miss an upload. And drop a comment below. Have you ever watched someone close to you stay in a relationship that felt wrong, without being able to name exactly why? Tell me what you saw. I read every single one. There is a suburb in southern Sydney that sits right at the edge of Botany Bay, where the water comes in close enough that on still mornings you can hear it from the street. Its name is Sans Souci, in French, that translates directly as without worry. It is a small, low-rise waterfront community built on the kind of geography that makes ordinary life feel generous. Residential streets that slope gently toward the shore. Parks where kids have kicked football since before their parents were born. And a general, unhurried sense that the weekend is never too far away. This is where Lilie James grew up. She was born in 2002 to Jamie and Peter James. And from the beginning, her world was shaped by two things: water and family. The James household was the kind of home that other kids wanted to be in. Not because of anything extravagant, but because of the quality of warmth inside it. Jamie and Peter were the sort of parents who showed up, not just to the big moments, but to the Tuesday afternoon training sessions, and the school assemblies and the ordinary weeknight dinners that, in retrospect, are the ones you remember most. Sans Souci itself was a natural extension of that household. The suburb has a particular culture, outdoor, physical, community-rooted, that suited Lilie completely. Summer in Sans Souci meant long afternoons at the water's edge. the smell of sunscreen and barbecue smoke drifting together across the park, and children who had grown up swimming thinking nothing of jumping into the bay the way other kids jump onto a trampoline. It was the kind of childhood geography that gives a person a specific, settled confidence. Not arrogance, not entitlement, just the deep, quiet certainty that comes from having always known where you belong. Lilie belonged there, and she knew it, and it showed. What her parents gave her was not just a loving home. They gave her a model. They gave her a template for what relationships between people were supposed to look like. The consistency, the mutual respect, the warmth that did not come and go depending on mood or circumstance. That template would define her expectations of the world for the rest of her life. She grew up believing, with good reason, that the people who love you show it. That love is not ambiguous, that it is not something you have to earn back over and over again. Those who knew the James family describe them in terms that are remarkably consistent, close, present, grounded. Peter and Jamie were not hovering parents. They raised Lilie with independence, with confidence in her own judgment, with the understanding that a person who knows their own worth will make better decisions than one who does not. They were right about all of it. And then, in October 2023, all of it was taken from them in a school bathroom on a Wednesday evening, less than 15 kilometers from the suburb whose name means without worry. Lilie James was not the kind of child who sat still. From the time she was small, movement was her language. She swam before most children her age had fully committed to the idea of putting their faces under water. She danced. She competed. She threw herself into the physical world with a wholehearted enthusiasm that was entirely her own. Not pushed, not performed, but genuine in the way that only early passions are. The water, in particular, claimed her early. Growing up in Sans Souci, where the bay was practically a backyard, swimming was less a sport and more a birthright, and Lilie took to it with the easy confidence of someone who had simply found the thing they were meant to do. But it was water polo that became her sport. There is something fitting about that, in retrospect. Swimming rewards the solitary. Water polo demands the collective. It is a sport built on trust. Trust in your teammates' positioning, trust in their decisions, trust that the person beside you in the water is working toward the same goal with the same commitment. It requires you to read people quickly, to communicate clearly under pressure, and to lead without being asked. Every single one of those qualities would go on to define who Lilie James was outside the pool as much as inside it. She trained hard. She competed at a level that required genuine sacrifice. Early mornings, late afternoons, weekends given over to tournaments rather than social plans. And she did it willingly, cheerfully, without the resentment that sometimes creeps into young athletes who are pushed further than their own appetite for the sport. Lilie's appetite was her own. No one had to convince her to go to training. The question was never whether she wanted to, it was simply what time. Dancing ran alongside all of it, a counterpoint to the aggression of the pool. Where water polo asked her to compete, dance asked her to express. Where one sport demanded strategy, the other demanded feeling. She moved between both worlds with the natural ease of someone who had never been told she had to choose one thing and be only that. And then there was the laugh. Ask anyone who knew Lilie James to describe her, and they will mention it within the first 30 seconds. It was not a polite laugh, not the carefully modulated response people deploy in professional settings to signal engagement. It was full and unguarded and completely infectious, the kind of laugh that begins somewhere genuine and arrives in the room before the person does. People remembered it the first time they heard it. It had a way of making whoever had caused it feel extraordinarily good about themselves, which meant that everyone around Lilie perpetually wanted to be the person who made her laugh again. That quality, the ability to make people feel seen, feel valued, feel like the most interesting version of themselves, is rarer than almost any other human gift. Most people who possess it have no idea that they do. Lilie had no idea that she did. She was just being herself. She was always just being herself, and in a world full of people performing versions of who they wanted to be seen as, that was extraordinary. That authenticity, the refusal to perform, the inability to be anything other than exactly who she was, followed Lilie James into every room she ever walked into, including, in her early high school years, the classrooms and corridors of Danebank Anglican School for girls in Hurstville. Danebank sits in Sydney's inner south, a girls' school with a strong academic culture and a genuine investment in the arts. For Lilie, it was the place where sport and performance converged, where the physical discipline she had built in the water found a parallel in the discipline of standing in front of an audience and making them feel something. She was the kind of student that teachers carry with them long after the school year ends. Not because she was the loudest, or the most academically driven, or the one who always had her hand up first, but because she was present in a way that is genuinely uncommon in adolescence. She listened when other people spoke. She gave her full attention, and people could feel it. Drama specifically became a place where something in Lilie crystallized. There is a particular courage required to perform, to stand in front of peers at an age when every instinct screams self-consciousness, and to commit fully to a character, to a moment, to an emotion. Most teenagers hedge. They perform the performance rather than the feeling underneath it. Lilie did not hedge. She committed. Her HSC drama monologue was drawn from Macbeth. The choice alone says something. Not a safe, accessible text, but Shakespeare, dense, demanding, emotionally violent in its undertow. The footage of that performance was uploaded to the Danebank School website as a showcase of student work. It sat there for years, largely unseen beyond the community it was made for. And then, in October 2023, the school left it there, because it had become something else entirely. The 21-year-old woman who no longer existed was on that screen, performing with full commitment and full heart, entirely unaware of the terrible future that awaited her. People who had never heard the name Lilie James before that week watched that footage and wept. Then came 2020. Lilie's graduating year at Danebank was swallowed whole by a pandemic that cancelled everything the final year of school is supposed to mean. No formal, no graduation ceremony with family packed into rows of chairs taking photographs. No slow, collective farewell to a chapter of life that, once closed, never reopens. COVID stripped the class of 2020 of all of it, and there was nothing anyone could do but absorb the loss and keep moving. Lilie kept moving. That resilience, the practical, unglamorous capacity to accept what cannot be changed and redirect energy toward what can, was not something she performed for anyone's benefit. It was simply how she operated. The friends who went through that strange, muted graduation beside her describe a young woman who acknowledged the disappointment honestly and then got on with it. No catastrophizing, no performance of grief. Just the straightforward acknowledgement that this was not ideal, followed by the decision to move forward anyway. It was exactly that quality, steady, grounded, forward-facing, that would carry her into the next chapter. University, water polo at the highest level she had yet played, a career beginning to take shape, and a corridor at St. Andrew's Cathedral School where, one afternoon, she would meet a man named Paul Thijssen. But that is still ahead. The University of Technology Sydney sits at the edge of the city's centre, close enough to the CBD that its students move fluidly between lecture halls and the pulse of professional life without adjusting their stride. For Lilie James, who arrived there in 2021 with a place in the sports business program, the choice was entirely deliberate. This was the place where the two dominant forces in her life, sport and ambition, were finally being asked to work together in a formal, structured way. She had grown up inside sport, the training, the competition, the particular satisfaction of improving at something through sustained effort. But alongside all of that, A second interest had quietly taken shape: the mechanics of how sport functioned as an institution, how teams were built and managed, how organizations made decisions, how the business of sport shaped the experience of playing it, coaching it, watching it. Sports business was not a compromise between two interests. For Lilie, it was the exact point where everything she cared about converged. Her peers at UTS described someone who engaged with her studies seriously without performing that seriousness for anyone else. She was not the student who announced her ambition loudly in seminars. She was the one who had clearly done the reading, whose contributions to group work were prepared and considered, and who could move between conversations about sports science and business strategy with the ease of someone who had never experienced them as separate concerns. Her coaching role at St. Andrew's Cathedral School ran alongside her degree from early in her university years. St. Andrew's is one of Sydney's most established private schools, located in the CBD, with institutional expectations that demand real quality from the people operating within it. Lilie was coaching water polo there, a sport she understood from years inside it, and by every account she was exceptional at it. The players she coached did not simply respect her, they adored her. There is a specific kind of coach that athletes carry with them long after the season ends. Not necessarily the one who extracted the strongest performance from them, but the one who made them feel genuinely capable of things they had not yet tried. Lilie was that coach. She had an instinct for reading what each individual player needed, when encouragement would open something up, when direct feedback delivered quietly after a session would land better than anything said mid-competition. She led from warmth, always. Her authority was real, and it was built entirely on care rather than control. Her colleagues at St. Andrews felt it too. She was 21 years old, working alongside educators and coaches who had decades of professional experience behind them, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that was entirely earned. There was no performance in it. People trusted her. People wanted to work beside her. The age gap registered as irrelevant almost immediately, because genuine competence and character speak more directly than tenure ever could. By October 2023, Lilie James had built a life with real shape and direction, a degree she cared about, a coaching role already defining her professionally, a family who loved her with the steady constancy she had known her whole life, teammates, students who looked up to her, and friends who had gathered around her simply because she was exactly who she was, openly and consistently, and that had always been more than enough. She was 21 years old, just beginning to navigate adult life and the relationships that came with it. She had no reason to believe it would not continue. In the weeks before October 25th, 2023, Lilie James was living the life she had built for herself, piece by piece, with the same quiet deliberateness that had always characterized the way she moved through the world. The mornings often started early. Water polo training demanded that. The pool does not accommodate sleeping in, and the discipline of early rising had been part of Lilie's routine for so long that it had long since stopped feeling like sacrifice. There is a particular quality to early morning training sessions that athletes know and non-athletes rarely imagine correctly. It is not punishing. It is, in its way, peaceful. The pool before the city is fully awake, the water holding a stillness that the rest of the day will not offer, the body doing what it has been trained to do, the mind free to go quiet for an hour before the demands of the day begin stacking up. For Lilie, those sessions were not just about fitness or performance. They were the foundation on which the rest of her day was built. After training came the UT's lecture halls. The sports business degree was in its later stages, and the coursework had moved into the territory that Lilie found most genuinely engaging: the organizational side of sport, the decision-making frameworks, the business models that kept sporting institutions functioning at a professional level. She sat in those lectures as someone who already had one foot inside the industry she was studying. The coaching role at St. Andrews gave her practical context that most of her peers were still waiting for, and it showed in the quality of the thinking she brought to her academic work. She was not studying toward an abstract future. She was studying toward a future she was already partially living. The corridors of St. Andrew's Cathedral School had their own particular rhythm. A private school in the Sydney CBD operates with an institutional polish that is immediately perceptible. The way staff move through the space, the expectations built into the physical environment itself. Lilie moved through those corridors with the ease of someone who had found her place within an institution and felt entirely at home in it. Her students saw her arriving, and something in the room shifted in the direction of readiness. Not because of any authority she projected, but because she had earned their trust and they wanted to be there. That is the rarest outcome in coaching at any level. She had achieved it at 21, and then at the end of the day there was Sans Souci, the family home, Petter and Jamie, the dinner table that had been the constant of her entire life. Home for Lilie was not a retreat or a refuge from difficulty. It was simply the place she returned to, the fixed point that everything else orbited around. The suburb outside the windows was the same one she had grown up in, with the water still visible if you found the right angle from the right street, the neighborhood still moving at the same unhurried pace it always had. From the outside and from the inside, there was nothing unusual about any of it, nothing that flagged itself as the final weeks of a chapter. Life did not announce what was coming. It simply continued in all its ordinary detail, the training sessions and the lectures and the coaching and the family dinners, giving no indication whatsoever that it was running out of time. That is the unbearable truth at the center of stories like this one. The worst things that happen to people do not arrive with warning. They arrive in the middle of ordinary life, on an ordinary Wednesday evening, while the rest of the city is going about its business entirely unaware. There is no atmospheric shift, no signal that today is different from yesterday, just the regular, textured, fully inhabited life of a 21-year-old woman who had every reason to expect it to continue, continuing, right up until the moment it did not. Lilie James walked into St. Andrew's Cathedral School on the evening of October 25th, 2023, the same way she had walked into it every other time, with purpose, with warmth, with absolutely no reason to walk in any other way. What was waiting for her inside did not belong to her life. It belonged to someone else's darkness entirely. Here is something that will sit uncomfortably with you, and it is meant to. Paul Thijssen was, by every external measure, the kind of young man that communities point to with pride. He was athletic. He was articulate. He was the sort of person who remembered your name, who showed up on time, who smiled at the right moments. He held leadership positions at school. He coached young athletes. He earned the trust of teachers, colleagues, parents, and institutions without appearing to work particularly hard at any of it, because the performance was so thoroughly practiced that it had become indistinguishable from character. If you had met him at a school function, a staff meeting, or a casual social gathering in the years before October 2023, you would have come away with a favorable impression. Most people did. Now ask yourself something honestly. How well do you actually know the people in your life who have only ever shown you their best face? Not the people who have struggled openly in front of you, or argued with you, or let you see them at their lowest, but the ones who are somehow always composed, always presenting well, always performing competence, warmth, and stability in every room they enter. Because that is where the danger that most people never see coming, not in the person who looks unstable, not in the one whose behavior occasionally alarms you, the danger that is hardest to detect, and therefore the hardest to protect yourself from, lives inside the gap between the performance and the reality. And the wider that gap is, the more energy is required to maintain it. Paul Thijssen had maintained that gap for years. across institutions, across countries, across relationships. The evidence was there, scattered across the years of his life like fragments of a picture that no one ever assembled into its full shape, until it was too late. This is the story of who he actually was. Paul Thijssen was born in the Netherlands, a country that, by most measurable standards, offers its children an exceptionally stable foundation. Strong public institutions, high living standards, a cultural emphasis on directness, pragmatism, and community participation. A place where, on the surface at least, the conditions for a grounded upbringing are readily available. He grew up as an only child. That detail is not offered here as an explanation for anything. Only children grow into well-adjusted, empathetic, grounded adults every single day, and the absence of siblings is not, by itself, a predictor of anything that follows. But it is worth noting, because it is part of the picture. An only child in a household is the sole recipient of parental focus, the full weight of expectation, the full benefit of resources, the full pressure of being the single point on which a family's hopes and pride are concentrated. For some children, that is a gift. For others, it quietly constructs a set of beliefs about themselves and their place in the world that are difficult to examine from the inside. His household appeared stable. That word, appeared, is going to do a great deal of work throughout this section, and it is worth pausing on it here, at the beginning, before the facts begin to accumulate. Appearing stable and being stable are not the same thing. Appearing happy and being happy are not the same thing. Appearing to have it together and actually having it together are, in some cases, the precise opposite of each other. Nothing in what is publicly known about Thijssen's early childhood in the Netherlands points to overt trauma or obvious dysfunction. There was no documented crisis, no known incident, no single event that forensic psychologists or court-appointed clinicians later identified as the origin point of what he became. That is precisely what makes it so difficult to trace and so important to sit with. The fractures, if they existed, were invisible, the cracks were interior, and the exterior, as it would remain for years across schools and countries and relationships, was smooth, polished, and entirely convincing. He appeared in every way that mattered to the people around him to be absolutely fine. In 2015, Paul Thijssen arrived at St Andrew's Cathedral School in Sydney as a 15-year-old international student from the Netherlands. He was, by the account of everyone who encountered him during those years, an immediate and impressive presence. St Andrew's is not a school where average slides are unnoticed. It is one of Sydney's most academically and athletically demanding private institutions, situated in the heart of the CBD, with a student body drawn from families who expect performance and an institutional culture that reinforces that expectation at every level. Arriving there as a foreign student, without the established social networks that most of his classmates had been building since primary school, required a particular kind of confidence. Thijssen had it in abundance. He moved through the school's sporting programs with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of stage. Cricket, hockey, two sports that, at a school like St Andrew's, carry genuine institutional weight. Not simply recreational activities, but serious competitive programs with reputations to protect. Thijssen excelled at both. He earned his place on teams not as a tolerated newcomer, but as a contributor of genuine quality. The kind of player whose presence on the field shifted the calculation for everyone around him. He was made sports captain. He joined the school's leadership team. Teachers found him engaged, respectful, and mature for his age. Peers found him likable. He was the international student who had, within a remarkably short period, not simply integrated but risen. By the time he left St Andrews in 2017 to return to the Netherlands and begin a university degree, he had accumulated the kind of institutional goodwill that most students spend their entire school careers working toward. That goodwill did not go to waste. St Andrews offered him a position as an assistant coach, and he accepted. That decision deserves more than a passing mention. He was a young man who had just completed secondary school, who had an entire university degree ahead of him, who had the youth and the opportunity to move in any direction he chose. The world, by any reasonable measure, was available to him, and what he chose was to maintain his connection to the same school, to embed himself further into the institution that had given him his platform, his titles, his sense of significance. There is a question worth sitting with here. When a young man is given the full breadth of his future and elects, repeatedly, to return to the same contained environment where he was once celebrated, where his status is already established, where the power dynamic already favors him, what is that telling us? It is telling us that the identity St. Andrews had helped him construct was not something he was willing to leave behind. It was telling us that the performance of being impressive required an audience already primed to be impressed. He needed the institution more than it needed him. He just did not know it yet. Paul Thijssen returned to Australia in 2020. On paper, and to everyone around him, the picture was straightforward. A young Dutch man with a strong sporting background, returning to a country he knew well, to an institution that already held him in high regard. By 2020, he was operating at St. Andrew's Cathedral School as a full-time cricket and hockey coach and after-hours coordinator, a role that gave him genuine professional standing, daily access to young athletes, and a continued position of trust within one of Sydney's most respected private schools. He was also listed as a hockey coach at St. Vincent's College in Potts Point, extending his professional footprint across two institutions simultaneously. To the world watching, he was exactly what he appeared to be: energetic, knowledgeable, dedicated. The kind of young sports professional who had found his calling early and was building something real. Colleagues found him capable. Parents of students trusted him with their children. The school's administration had no visible reason to look more closely. But there was another version of events running in parallel, invisible to almost everyone around him. Thijssen had told friends and family that his reason for returning to Australia was to complete a master's degree. It was the kind of ambition that made complete sense for someone of his profile, a young professional looking to formalize his expertise, to add academic credentials to practical experience. No one questioned it. It fit the image. It was exactly the sort of thing a person like Paul Thijssen would be doing. Here was no enrollment on record, not at any Australian university, not in any master's program. The degree he described to the people who trusted him did not exist, because he had never applied for it. The story was a construction, one piece of a larger architecture of deception that, when it eventually came to light during the coronial inquest, revealed the full extent of what he had been willing to fabricate in order to maintain the life he had built for himself. The visa documents used to secure his return to Australia had been forged. Statements from his employer had been embellished beyond recognition of the truth. He had assembled, with remarkable patience and precision, a fictional version of himself. A version that was always studying, always progressing, always on the credible trajectory of a capable young professional, with everything ahead of him. And he maintained it, day after day, in a country where he had no family, and where the people most likely to expose the gap between the performance and the reality were thousands of kilometers away. At the coronial inquest that followed his death in October 2023, forensic psychologist Kate Seidler provided testimony that cut directly to the interior mechanics of all of this. Her assessment described a man with a fragile sense of self, an identity not built from the inside out, from genuine self-knowledge and acceptance, but constructed entirely from the outside in. From titles, from performance, from the consistent, exhausting work of being seen in exactly the right light by exactly the right people. When your identity is built on the performance of perfection, every crack becomes an existential threat. Every moment of failure, every exposure of the gap between who you claim to be and who you actually are, does not simply sting, it threatens the entire structure, because the structure was never real. It was assembled from appearances, and appearances are fragile things. Paul Thijssen had been maintaining that structure for years, and in 2020, in a school in the Sydney CBD where he was trusted completely, he was still maintaining it. For now, understanding what Paul Thijssen did on the evening of October 25, 2023, requires understanding something that is deeply uncomfortable to sit with. That violence of this kind rarely erupts without warning from a stable interior. It grows. It grows slowly and underground, and in conditions that the person themselves may never fully examine, because examination would require confronting the thing they have spent their entire lives running from. Kate Seidler's testimony at the coronial inquest did not describe a man who was simply bad. It described a man who felt at his core inadequate, unworthy, fundamentally insufficient in ways that he could neither articulate nor tolerate. Those feelings, and the relentless, exhausting effort required to keep them buried beneath the performance of competence and confidence, are the engine of everything that followed. There is a particular kind of person who responds to deep feelings of inadequacy not by seeking genuine connection or honest self-examination, but by constructing a version of themselves that cannot be questioned. Every achievement becomes a brick in a wall. Every title, every position of authority, every relationship in which they are admired rather than truly known becomes another layer of insulation between the self they project and the self they are terrified of being seen as. The construction works, for a time. It works precisely because it is thorough. People see the wall and assume it is the whole building, but a wall is not a foundation. And without a foundation, every external pressure becomes a structural threat. For Thijssen, control was not simply a preference or a personality trait. It was a survival mechanism. The need to manage how he was perceived, to script the narrative of his own life and ensure that nothing fell outside his direction, was the mechanism by which the fragile interior was kept intact. While he controlled the image held. While he controlled the relationships around him, the performance was sustainable. While the people in his life saw only what he chose to show them, the gap between the performance and the reality remained his secret alone. The problem with building your sense of self entirely around control is that the world does not cooperate indefinitely. Circumstances shift, people make their own decisions, and when someone within the carefully managed landscape of your constructed life does something outside your script, when they act with genuine independence, when they decline to play the role assigned to them, the response is not frustration, it is terror, because their independence is not merely inconvenient, it is to a person whose entire identity depends on the performance remaining intact, an act of demolition. Dr. Danny Sullivan and Tim Watson-Munro, both clinical and criminal psychologists who assessed Thijssen, contributed professional evaluations that, alongside Seidler's testimony, built a consistent picture. A man whose psychological architecture was oriented entirely around the prevention of exposure, not exposure of the forged documents or the fabricated master's degree, though those were real and significant. The deeper exposure he feared was simpler and more devastating than any of that. It was the exposure of the ordinary, insufficient, unexceptional person he believed himself to actually be. When Lilie James ended their relationship, she did not simply leave him. In the architecture of his psychology, she threatened to take the wall down, and he could not allow that. But before Lilie James, there was someone else. This is the part of Paul Thijssen's story that did not make headlines until after a young woman was already dead. It is the part that, had it been handled differently, had it been documented, recorded, and acted upon by the systems designed to do exactly that, may have changed everything. It did not change anything. And that failure belongs not to any single person, but to the wider structural silence that has always surrounded male behavior that stops just short of what the law will formally recognize. Thijssen had a previous relationship with an Australian girlfriend. The relationship followed a pattern that, in retrospect and with full knowledge of what came later, is deeply recognizable. At the time, like most patterns of this kind, it was experienced as a series of individual incidents rather than what it actually was. A coherent, escalating expression of a man who could not tolerate the boundaries of another person. It began with the demand for location sharing. He wanted to know where she was. Not as the casual, mutually agreed upon arrangement that some couples choose freely, but as a requirement. A condition of the relationship that sat underneath the surface and made its weight felt whenever it was not met. When she turned the location sharing off, his response was not measured. It was explosive. The disproportionality of that response, the gap between the action, which was simply a woman exercising a basic right to privacy, and the reaction, which was rage, was the first clear signal of what was underneath the constructed exterior. He began waiting outside her workplace, hours at a time, not announced, not invited, simply present, in the way that a person who cannot tolerate being outside someone else's awareness makes themselves visible as a reminder of that fact. Her colleagues noticed. The situation began to cause alarm, and then the alarm spread to her family. Her parents watched a young man attach himself to their daughter with an intensity that went beyond affection into something that had no comfortable name. The discomfort in her household grew. And then she made the decision that she was entirely entitled to make. She ended the relationship and blocked him. He bought a flight. That detail should be allowed to stand on its own for a moment, because it is the detail that makes everything else impossible to dismiss as ordinary relationship difficulty or the ordinary pain of a breakup. He was in the Netherlands. She had blocked him. She had communicated in the clearest terms available to her that she did not want contact, and his response to that communication was to board an intercontinental flight to Australia, specifically, deliberately, for the purpose of pursuing a woman who had made her wishes entirely plain. When he arrived and she refused him, he became physically violent. He did not strike her, but he placed his violence near her head, close enough to communicate what he was capable of, close enough to ensure she felt it, while remaining in the territory that is so difficult to prosecute because it stops at the boundary of what the law requires to act. It was controlled violence, targeted violence, the violence of a man who understood exactly where the line was and positioned himself just close enough to it to cause maximum impact without crossing it formally. He appeared uninvited at her family home. Her father threatened to call the police. No charges were laid. No apprehended violence order was sought. No formal record was created that would follow Paul Thijssen into the next chapter of his life, into the next institution that trusted him, into the next relationship with the next woman who had no way of knowing what had already happened. The incident was absorbed. It joined the vast, invisible archive of male behavior that communities process quietly, that families manage privately, that women carry alone, the archive that only becomes visible after something happens that is too large and too final to absorb. The warning was already written. It was written in the hours outside her workplace, in the intercontinental flight, in the violence placed deliberately near her head, in her father standing in his own doorway telling a young man to leave. It was written clearly, in every language available, and not a single word of it was recorded. There is a phrase used in domestic violence research and advocacy that does not get nearly enough attention in the conversations that follow cases like this one. It is this: coercive control is a pattern, not an incident. It is not a single moment of violence or a single transgression that can be weighed in isolation. It is a sustained campaign of behavior, monitoring, intimidation, boundary violation, and the calculated deployment of fear that operates across time and accumulates its damage gradually in ways that are often invisible to the systems designed to intervene. Paul Thijssen's behavior toward his previous girlfriend was not an incident. It was a pattern. the location sharing demands, the explosive response to her privacy, the hours outside her workplace, the intercontinental flight, the violence positioned near her head, the uninvited appearance at her family home. Each of those, examined individually, can be made to seem manageable, explainable, the kind of thing that gets filed under difficult breakup and moved past. Examined together as a sequence, they form something that is not difficult to name at all. They form the profile of a man who believed, at a fundamental level, that the people in his life were not permitted to act outside his control. And yet, when his previous girlfriend's father stood in his doorway and told Paul Thijssen to leave, when that confrontation reached its conclusion, no one called the police. No apprehended violence order was pursued. No formal documentation was created. No record existed that would follow him from that household into the next institution, the next city, the next relationship. This is not an isolated failure. It is the representative failure, the one that appears with depressing consistency in the histories of men who eventually crossed the line that Paul Thijssen crossed on October 25th, 2023. The research is not ambiguous on this point. Men who kill intimate partners or former partners almost always have a prior history of controlling behavior. In the majority of cases, that history was known to someone, a family member, a friend, a colleague, a previous partner who survived. In a significant proportion of those cases, it was reported, or partially reported, or present in the awareness of people who did not know what to do with what they were seeing. The gap between knowing and acting is where women die. Australia has, in the years since Lilie James was murdered, been engaged in a painful national reckoning with exactly this failure. The coronial inquest into her death, presided over by NSW State Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan and led by counsel assisting Jennifer Single SC, was not simply an examination of what happened on one Wednesday evening in October 2023. It was an examination of the entire landscape that made that evening possible. The institutional gaps, the absence of information-sharing mechanisms, the systemic inability to connect the dots of a man's behavior across time and geography into a picture that might have triggered intervention before it was too late. Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, a domestic violence expert who provided testimony during the inquest, has argued consistently and publicly that the way Australia identifies records and responds to coercive control is inadequate. That adequacy costs lives. That the absence of a formal record following Thijssen's behavior toward his previous girlfriend was not simply an administrative oversight. It was a structural wound in the system's ability to protect the next woman. There was a next woman. Her name was Lilie James, and the question that hangs over everything that follows in this story, the question that the coronial inquest asked formally, that Peter and Jamie James have asked publicly, and that every person who has followed this case has asked privately, is this: what would have changed if someone had spoken up? What would have changed if a formal record had been created? If an apprehended violence order had been sought? If the institutions that employed Paul Thijssen had access to a documented history of the behavior he exhibited toward a woman who told him clearly that she did not want him in her life? There is no certain answer to that question. Systems fail even when records exist. Documentation does not automatically produce intervention. The honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty what a formal record would have changed. But Lilie James might have had the chance to make an informed decision. She might have known what she was walking toward before she was already inside it. She never got that chance. Before October 25th, 2023, there were 5 weeks. And before those 5 weeks, there was a corridor to understand how Lilie James and Paul Thijssen came to be in each other's lives. It is necessary to step back from the evening that ended everything and return to the months that preceded it, to the ordinary, unremarkable environment in which the two of them had been operating simultaneously, in the same institution, without incident, for some time before anything between them began. St. Andrew's Cathedral School is a large and busy place. Its staff body encompasses teachers, coaches, administrative personnel, and support staff who move through shared spaces every day. The staff room, the corridors between playing fields, the areas adjacent to courts and pools where debriefs happen informally at the end of practice sessions. Familiarity is the natural consequence of shared space and shared purpose. People who work in the same building toward broadly similar goals with the same students in common build rapport. It happens without effort. It happens because human beings are wired for it. That is how it began. Lilie and Paul were colleagues. They occupied the same professional landscape. They passed each other in the way that people who work in the same place pass each other, with the easy acknowledgement of familiarity, the small exchanges that accumulate into something that feels, from the inside, like a genuine connection forming naturally. For Lilie, who was 21 and navigating adult relationships for the first time with the same openness and good faith she brought to everything else in her life, what developed between them was something exploratory, something light. The early tentative feeling of a possible connection, considered carefully by someone who trusted her own judgment and had no reason not to. For Paul Thijssen, the evidence would later make clear, it was something else entirely. Something that had weight and direction and purpose from the beginning. Not the uncomplicated feeling of two people discovering each other, but the calculated orientation of a man who had already decided what he wanted and was moving toward it. The 5 weeks that followed were not a relationship in any meaningful sense of that word. They were the first phase of something that would not end until a Wednesday evening in October. Before this story goes any further, if what you are hearing is making you think of someone you know, someone whose relationship has always felt slightly off in ways you could not quite name, share this video with them, right now, before you forget. You might be the person who puts the right words to something they have been carrying alone. Drop a comment below as well. Have you ever watched someone you cared about confuse obsession for love? Tell me what that looked like. Every single comment gets read, and if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. There is more to come. The 5 weeks of their relationship were not violent. There was no raised hand, no raised voice that crossed into territory anyone who witnessed it could point to and name clearly. What there was instead was quieter, and in its quietness, far more difficult for the people around it to process into something actionable. There was the phone. Snapchat as a platform has a location sharing feature. It is a function that exists in the landscape of modern relationships in a variety of forms, some mutual, some casual, some entirely unexamined by the people who use it. Couples share locations. Friends share locations. The technology is ordinary enough that its presence in a relationship does not automatically register as anything other than the normal texture of how people in their 20s stay connected. But there is a version of location sharing that is not connected. It is surveillance. And the difference between the two is not in the technology. It is in who controls it, who demands it, and what happens when the indicator on the screen moves somewhere unexpected. During the 5 weeks that Lilie and Paul were together, people around them noticed something. At a dinner table, the kind of ordinary social gathering that fills the calendar of any young person with an active life, Paul Thijssen was not fully present. He was at the table, participating in conversation, performing the role of someone enjoying an evening with people he knew. But his eyes returned to his phone with a regularity that sat outside what anyone would describe as normal. He was checking something. He was checking it often. And what he was checking, those who later examined the evidence understood, was a small digital indicator on a map, a marker that told him in real time exactly where Lilie James was. She was not at the dinner table. She was somewhere else. And the fact of her being somewhere he was not, doing something he was not part of with people he could not directly observe, was a fact he was monitoring with the focus of someone for whom that information was not incidental. It was necessary. The people at that table who noticed said nothing formal. The observation was filed in the category of a bit much, the vast, capacious category into which behavior that makes people uncomfortable but does not cross an obvious line gets quietly placed. He is really into her. He is a bit obsessive. He is very attentive. The language available for what they were watching was the language of affection, deployed slightly too intensely, not the language of what it actually was. What it actually was has a clinical name. At the coronial inquest into Lilie James's death, the behaviors exhibited by Paul Thijssen during and after their 5-week relationship were examined in forensic detail and identified formally as coercive control. That term, coercive control, is not dramatic language. It is not the vocabulary of tabloid coverage or sensationalized true crime. It is a precise, clinical description of a pattern of behavior in which one person in a relationship systematically works to monitor, restrict, and dominate the other's freedom of movement, social connections, and sense of reality. Coercive control does not always announce itself with a raised fist. It announces itself with a phone checked too many times at a dinner table, with a question about where you were that comes too quickly after you arrive, with a relationship that, from the inside, begins to feel slightly smaller than you remembered agreeing to. Lilie James was 21 years old and had spent her entire life surrounded by people who loved her with openness and without conditions. The texture of what she was experiencing with Paul Thijssen was unfamiliar to her in ways she may not yet have had the full vocabulary to articulate. She acted on what she knew, with the clarity that had always characterized the way she moved through the world. She ended it. The decision to end a relationship is, in most circumstances, one of the most quietly ordinary things a person can do. It does not require justification. It does not require a catalogue of grievances serious enough to meet some external threshold of acceptability. It requires only the knowledge, however it arrives, that this is not right, and the willingness to act on that knowledge honestly. Lilie James had that willingness in abundance. She was 21 years old. She had a degree she was invested in, a coaching role she had earned, a family she was close to, and a social life full of people who knew and loved the real, complete, unguarded version of her. Her life had shape and direction and warmth entirely independent of any relationship. She did not need Paul Thijssen to complete a picture that was already whole. She had tried something, examined it honestly, and reached a clear conclusion. 5 weeks. That was the full duration of what existed between them. Not months of intertwined lives, not shared history deep enough to complicate the untangling. 5 weeks. Examined and found wanting by a young woman who trusted her own assessment of her own life. She ended it with the same directness and self-possession that had characterized everything she did. There was no ambiguity in what she communicated. She was not equivocating, not softening it into something that could be interpreted as temporary. She was done, and she said so clearly. From the outside, from any reasonable vantage point, that should have been the end of the story. A brief relationship concluded by mutual, or at the very least, accepted separation. 2 colleagues who would navigate the professional landscape of a shared workplace with the mature, unremarkable adjustment that adults make when personal and professional lives briefly intersect and then separate again. That is not what happened. Because what Lilie experienced as the conclusion of something short and uncomplicated, Paul Thijssen experienced it as something else entirely. In the architecture of his psychology, the fragile, performance-dependent interior that Kate Seidel's testimony would later illuminate so precisely, her decision was not the ordinary exercise of a personal right. It was a rupture. It was the removal of something he had already, in the compressed intensity of 5 weeks, incorporated into the constructed image of himself that required constant maintenance. She had not simply ended a relationship. She had, without any knowledge of what she was doing, stepped outside the script, and in doing so, she had unknowingly moved into the most dangerous period of the entire dynamic. Not the 5 weeks of the relationship, not the beginning when the control was just beginning to establish itself. What followed the ending was the most dangerous phase of all, and it was a phase that Lilie James, with every right to believe she had simply closed a door, had no way of knowing was only just beginning to open. Researchers and clinicians who work in the field of domestic violence and coercive control are consistent on one point that is not yet widely understood by the general public. The most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is not during the relationship. It is after it ends. The post-separation period, the weeks and months that follow a breakup in a relationship characterized by controlling behavior, is statistically the time of highest risk for the person who has left. This is not intuitive. The instinct is to assume that distance creates safety, that once the relationship is over, the threat recedes. But for a person whose need for control is the organizing principle of their psychology, the ending of a relationship is not accepted. It is responded to, and the response is escalation. Paul Thijssen's response began almost immediately. The Snapchat location monitoring did not stop when the relationship ended. It continued. While Lilie moved through her ordinary days, U-Test lectures, coaching sessions at St. Andrew's, training, the family home in Sans Souci, a small digital indicator on a screen somewhere was still tracking her movements for a man she had told clearly and finally that she was done with. The surveillance apparatus he had established during the relationship did not dismantle itself when she walked away. It simply continued operating invisibly, as though the ending she had declared had not registered. Then came the rental car. At some point in the weeks following the breakup, Thijssen obtained a rental vehicle. The significance of this detail is not incidental. He had access to his own car. The decision to use a rental was deliberate. A rental car is not registered to him, is not identifiable to anyone who knows his vehicle, and provides the specific operational advantage of being able to move through the streets of someone's neighborhood without the risk of being recognized. It is the decision of a person who is not acting impulsively. It is the decision of someone who was thinking carefully about what they were doing and how to avoid detection while doing it. He drove past Lilie's home in Sans Souci 7 times. 7 separate, documented occasions on which he navigated a vehicle down the street where she lived. Past the James family home, past the ordinary suburban geography of her childhood. Watching, noting, monitoring from the outside the life she had chosen to continue without him. And he did not simply drive past. He photographed the cars parked outside the house. He made notes. Those notes identified which vehicle belonged to which member of the James family, a systematic, deliberate effort to map the household's patterns, to know who was home and when, to understand the rhythms of the family's movements in the way that only someone building an operational picture would need to understand them. This is not the behavior of grief. Grief is private and interior and does not require reconnaissance. This is the behavior of planning, methodical, patient, and entirely concealed behind the face of a man who continued to appear to his colleagues and professional contacts as a dedicated young sports coach simply getting on with his life. That concealment is one of the most important details in this entire story, because it means that the people around Paul Thijssen in the weeks following the breakup had no access to what he was actually doing. The 2 versions of him, the professional, composed, reliable exterior, and the man driving a rental car down the street where Lilie James lived for the 7th time, existed in complete separation. No one who saw the first version had any reason to suspect the second. Lilie had ended the relationship. She had communicated her decision. She had every right to expect that her life in Sans Souci, in the UTS lecture halls, in the corridors of St. Andrew's was hers to move through freely. Instead, those spaces were already being watched. she did not know it, and the surveillance, having been established in the weeks following the breakup, was not finished. It was evolving. The surveillance that Paul Thijssen was conducting from the street, from inside a rental car, from the continued monitoring of a Snapchat location indicator, was external. It operated at a distance. The fake account was something different. It was an attempt to move inside, to create a presence within Lilie's digital social world that she could not identify as him, that would give him access to her movements and communications from within the circle of people she trusted. The account was created in the name of a female acquaintance. The choice of whose name to use was not accidental. A female name, belonging to someone within the broader social landscape that Lilie and her friends occupied, would attract none of the suspicion that his own name would immediately generate. It was designed to be invisible, to pass unremarked, to be accepted without scrutiny, to sit quietly inside the network while feeding information outward to the person who had built it. Lilie and a friend discovered it. The details of how the account was identified are less important than what happened immediately after it was. Because the discovery of a fake account created by an ex-boyfriend, operating under a false identity, positioned deliberately within your social circle to monitor you, is, by any ordinary reckoning, a moment that puts the person responsible on the back foot. It is an exposure. It is the moment the gap between the performance and the reality should have collapsed entirely, leaving Paul Thijssen with no credible position to occupy. He did not step back. He stepped forward. Within moments of being confronted, Thijssen inverted the narrative completely. He claimed with the fluency of someone who had prepared for exactly this contingency that he was the one being stalked, that the situation was not what it appeared to be, that the account, the monitoring, the entire apparatus of surveillance that Lilie and her friend had correctly identified, all of it was reframed, redirected, and reassigned. He was not the one doing the watching. He was the one being watched. He was not the threat. He was the victim. This is gaslighting, not in the loosely applied, culturally diluted sense in which that word is sometimes used, but in its precise, clinical meaning. The systematic manipulation of another person's perception of reality, executed with the specific intent of making them doubt what they have directly observed and correctly understood. The term originates from a stage play and later, a film in which a man manipulates the lighting in his house and then denies any change has occurred, causing his wife to question her own sanity. The mechanism is identical regardless of the context in which it appears. The person who has been caught in deception does not acknowledge the deception. They reframe it. They redirect attention. They introduce enough confusion into the confrontation that the person who arrived with clarity begins to leave with doubt. Lilie James did not deserve doubt. She deserved to have what she had found confirmed, validated, and acted upon by every system available to protect her. What she got instead was a man standing in front of her, telling her with apparent sincerity and total conviction that the thing she had clearly and correctly identified was not what she thought it was. At the coronial inquest, this incident was examined in the context of the broader pattern of behavior Paul Thijssen had exhibited from the earliest weeks of their time together. It was not an isolated event. It was a data point in a sequence, the fake account a natural extension of the Snapchat monitoring, the gaslighting a natural extension of the control. Each behavior grows from the last, each one serving the same organizing purpose, keeping Lilie James within a landscape that Paul Thijssen could see, manage, and direct. The confrontation was resolved without formal consequence. No report was made. The incident, like so many before it in the broader story of his behavior toward women, was absorbed. He had maintained the performance once again. Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, whose expertise in domestic violence informed some of the most significant testimony heard at the coronial inquest into Lilie's death, identified a specific evening as a pivotal escalation point in Paul Thijssen's behavior. It was a 21st birthday party, the kind of milestone social event that fills the calendar of any young person in their early 20s, ordinary in every external respect, distinguished from the dozens of similar occasions that preceded and followed it only by what was happening at its edges, in the darkness of a car parked outside. Lilie was attending the party. Thijssen knew she would be there. He also knew because the social geography of their shared world was limited enough that these things were known that he would not be unwelcome at the same event. They were no longer together, but they occupied overlapping social terrain, and the presence of both of them at the same gathering was not inherently unusual. What Thijssen did in the lead-up to that evening was unusual. He approached a mutual friend, someone who moved in the same social circle as both of them, and arranged for that person to monitor Lilie throughout the party. The mutual friend was not given the full picture of why this was being asked. The request was framed in terms that made it seem reasonable, or at the very least not alarming enough to refuse, the kind of framing that a person skilled in managing perceptions deploys without apparent effort. The mutual friend became, without full knowledge of their role, an extension of the surveillance architecture that Thijssen had been building around Lilie since the breakup. Throughout the evening, as the party continued inside, Thijssen was checking Lilie's location, repeatedly, with the same focused, compulsive regularity that had been observed at the dinner table weeks earlier during the relationship itself, except that the relationship was over, and the monitoring was therefore even less ambiguous in its meaning. He was tracking a woman he was no longer with, at a party he was not yet attending, using both technology and a person who did not know they were being used. Then he arrived. He did not go inside immediately. He sat in his car outside the venue for over an hour. That detail, the hour outside in the car watching, is one of the most telling in the entire post-separation period, because it is the behavior of someone conducting an assessment, not acting on impulse, not driven by the uncomplicated emotional urgency of someone who simply misses a person and cannot stay away. An hour is a considered duration. It is long enough to observe, long enough to think, long enough to make a decision about what comes next with something that resembles deliberation. Eventually he went inside, and at the end of the evening, Paul Thijssen drove Lilie James home. The people who observed this sequence of events, the arrival, the monitoring, the drive home, processed it through the cultural frame most readily available to them. A young man who is clearly still attached to a young woman he used to be with. Jealous, perhaps, a bit too invested. The kind of behavior that gets described, in the language of ordinary social observation, as him. Not being over her yet. Devotion misread as difficulty moving on. Intensity misread as lingering affection. Professor Kate Fitzgibbon's testimony at the inquest refused that frame entirely and replaced it with the one the evidence actually supported. What Thijssen exhibited that evening was not the emotional residue of a genuine attachment that had ended badly. It was predatory surveillance, the co-opting of a mutual friend, the hour in the car, the location monitoring, the drive home that placed him once again in physical proximity to a woman who had told him the relationship was finished. Each of those elements, examined individually, can be made to fit the more comfortable narrative. Examined together. As a coherent sequence, they form a picture that has nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with a man who had decided that Lilie James's decision to end the relationship was not a decision he was prepared to accept. The party ended. The drive home ended. The evening resolved without incident in the sense that nothing happened that could be formally reported or acted upon. But the escalation did not end. It had, if anything, found a new momentum. There is a behavior that sits so far outside the boundaries of what most people consider acceptable that it might seem, at first consideration, to belong to a different category from the location monitoring in the rental car and the hours outside the birthday party. It feels more violating, more deliberately cruel, more impossible to attribute to any motivation other than malice. But expert testimony at the coronial inquest placed it precisely where it belongs, not in a separate category, but as the next point on the same line. During the period following the breakup, Paul Thijssen shared an intimate photograph, an image Lilie James had sent him privately, within the context of a relationship in which she had extended to him the trust that intimacy requires with friends. Without her knowledge, without her consent, this account will not dwell on the image itself, because the image is not the point. The image was a vehicle. What matters, what the expert testimony at the inquest identified with precision, is what the act of sharing it was designed to do. It was not grief. A person in genuine grief does not weaponize the private moments of the person they have lost. It was not the impulsive, regrettable act of someone overwhelmed by the emotional chaos of heartbreak, because the behavior surrounding it was too consistent, too patterned, too clearly of a piece with everything else Thijssen was doing in the post-separation period to be attributed to a single, isolated moment of poor judgment. It was dominance. It was the assertion of ownership over a person who had withdrawn her consent to be owned. It was the act of a man who, having lost the ability to control Lilie James through proximity and surveillance and manipulation, reached for the one instrument remaining to him, the power to humiliate her in the eyes of people she knew. This is what expert testimony characterized it as, not as a secondary incident or an emotional side effect, but as a deliberate exercise of control. The mechanism is precise and recognizable. When direct control over another person is removed, the controlling person does not simply absorb the loss. They find another means of asserting their authority over the person who left. Humiliation is one of the most effective of those means, because it operates on the victim's interior, on their sense of self, on their standing in their own social world, on the private spaces they believed were protected. It connects, without ambiguity, to every behavior that preceded it. The location monitoring during the relationship, control of her movements, the rental car and the 7 passes, control of his proximity to her, the fake account, control of his access to her digital world, the CO-opted mutual friend and the hour outside the party, control of his information about her. And then this, control of how she was seen. Each act was a response to the same perceived loss. Each one escalated from the last. Each one was designed to close a gap that Lilie James had created by exercising the most ordinary human right available to her. She had said no, and he had spent the weeks since that refusal systematically working through every available mechanism to ensure that her no carried no real consequence for him. There was one mechanism remaining. In the days before October 25th, 2023, Paul Thijssen was at St. Andrew's Cathedral School. This was not unusual. He worked there. His presence in the building and the corridors near the sporting facilities was an ordinary professional fact that no one around him had any reason to examine. He was a coach. He belonged there. The institution that had first given him a platform as a 15-year-old student, that had welcomed him back as an assistant coach and then as a full-time staff member, continued to hold him within its structures, continued to extend to him the trust that employment confers. But what the school's CCTV footage later captured, and what investigators would examine in detail after October 25, was not a coach moving through his workplace in the ordinary course of his duties. Thijssen was conducting assessments. He moved through the gymnasium with a particular deliberate attention to spaces that had nothing to do with cricket preparation or hockey drills. He approached bathroom facilities. He moved between stalls. He tested the weight of doors. The specific, purposeful physical act of a person determining how a door behaves when it is closed, how much resistance it offers, how it sounds. He examined angles. He returned to certain spaces more than once, on more than one occasion, in the days leading up to the 25th. He was selecting a location. The horror of this, and it must be named plainly, is not simply in the act itself, though the act is devastating. The horror is in the duration. This was not a decision made in a moment of explosive, uncontrolled rage. This was a decision made in advance, revisited, refined, and prepared for. The gap between deciding and acting was filled not with hesitation or doubt, but with reconnaissance. Lilie James was alive during those days. She was coaching and studying and moving through the corridors of the same building. She had no knowledge of what was happening in the spaces just beyond her ordinary line of sight. He had already chosen the room. The morning of October 25th, 2023 began the way most Wednesday mornings begin in a city that does not know what is coming. Coffee orders were placed. Emails were sent. The unremarkable, domestic choreography of an ordinary day moved forward on its usual schedule. At some point in those morning hours, Paul Thijssen walked into a hardware store. The man who walked through that door had already made his decision. Not in that moment, not in some sudden crystallization of long-suppressed feeling, but days and weeks earlier in the gymnasium, in the bathroom stalls, testing door weights, analyzing angles, selecting the specific geography of what he intended to do. October 25 was not the moment the decision was made. It was the moment the decision, long since made, was carried out. There is a question that sits underneath this entire story, one that most people never have cause to consider in relation to the people they see every day. Do we truly see the people around us? Or do we see only the surface they have constructed for our benefit? The competent colleague, the committed coach, the reliable professional face in the corridor, while an entirely different reality operates just below what we can detect. Paul Thijssen's colleagues at St. Andrew's Cathedral School saw a coach. His students saw a mentor. The people who passed him in the building that Wednesday saw a man moving through a normal working day. None of them could see the hardware store receipt. None of them could see what was in his bag. A 21-year-old woman went to work that evening. She drove to a school she knew well. She walked through corridors she had walked through dozens of times before, carrying the ordinary confidence of someone who belongs somewhere. She did not know that the day she was moving through had been planned around her. She did not come home. Stay with this. Bear witness to what happened and to why bearing witness matters. This is October 25th, 2023. Everything before this moment was preparation. This is the day itself. The hardware store visit was not impulsive. That point cannot be made too clearly because the alternative framing, a man driven past endurance, acting in a moment of overwhelming emotional collapse, is one that defense narratives sometimes reach for, and one that the evidence in this case does not support. Thijssen walked into a hardware store on the morning of October 25th, 2023, and he purchased a hammer. The hammer was not something he happened upon or selected in the grip of a sudden, uncontrolled impulse. It was something he went to acquire, deliberately, on the morning of the day he intended to use it. The purchase was preceded by weeks of preparation that collectively confirmed the hammer was the final item required to complete a plan assembled over time, with the focused attention of someone who intended to succeed. He had a rental car. This vehicle was separate from the rental used in the post-separation surveillance weeks earlier, when he had driven past Lilie's home in Sans Souci 7 times. That earlier rental served the surveillance operation. This one, on October 25th, served the day's specific purpose. The pattern of using a vehicle that cannot be immediately identified as his own was not new. It was a consistent feature of the way Paul Thijssen operated whenever he was doing something he did not want traced back to him. He drove to St. Andrew's Cathedral School and arrived at work. And then, and this is the detail that criminal psychologist Tim Watson Munro addressed directly in his professional assessment of Thijssen's state of mind, he spent the day coaching. He conducted sessions. He coordinated activities. He moved through the school in his professional capacity, interacting with students, fulfilling the obligations of his role, performing the version of himself that the institution had always known. The hammer was in his possession. The plan was fully formed. The evening's events had already been decided. Tim Watson Munro, who has spent decades assessing the psychology of individuals who commit acts of extreme violence, was precise in his professional conclusion. Thijssen had a clear intention. The composure he displayed throughout the school day was not the composure of a man who had not yet decided what he was going to do. It was the composure of a man who had decided who was waiting, and who was managing the hours between the decision and its execution with a patience that is, in itself, one of the most revealing features of his psychological profile. That distinction between a person overtaken by uncontrollable emotion and a person executing a fully formed plan with discipline and patience is not a legal technicality or a matter of academic classification. It is the full, precise measure of what October 25th, 2023 was. Not a day on which control was lost, a day on which control was maintained, deliberately and completely, all the way to 7:11 in the evening. The dry runs that CCTV footage captured in the days before October 25 were not simply about identifying a location. They were about engineering one. St. Andrew's Cathedral School's gymnasium facility included more than one bathroom. This is an unremarkable architectural fact that becomes, in the context of what Thijssen was planning, a logistical problem requiring a solution. If Lilie had more than one bathroom available to her when she arrived at the gymnasium that evening, she could choose freely. She might choose the bathroom he had not selected. She might move through the building in a direction that did not align with the geography he had memorized. This possibility was addressed. On the evening of October 2005, 2023, a cleaning in progress sign was placed in front of one of the gymnasium bathrooms, the bathroom Thijssen had not chosen. The effect of that sign was precise and deliberate. It eliminated Lilie's options. If she needed to use a bathroom after arriving at the gymnasium that evening, there was now only one available to her. The disabled bathroom. The one he had visited on multiple occasions in the preceding days. The one whose door weight he knew, whose angles he had assessed, whose internal geography he had memorized with the attention of someone for whom that information was professionally necessary. The sign was not placed by a cleaner. This single act, the placement of a sign in front of a door, is the detail that most completely dismantles any remaining possibility that what occurred on October 25th was unplanned or driven by the chaos of overwhelming emotion. A sign placed to restrict another person's movement is an act of engineering. It requires advanced knowledge of the space, of the expected routine, of who will be arriving and when. It requires someone to think through the problem of uncontrolled variables and to address one of those variables with a piece of equipment retrieved from a storage cupboard and positioned in a corridor. It requires, in other words, a plan. The coronial inquest, presided over by NSW State Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan and examined with forensic precision by counsel assisting Jennifer Single SC, operated within a factual landscape that the CCTV footage and the physical evidence made impossible to misread. Both the dry runs, captured on camera in the preceding days, and the cleaning sign positioned on the evening itself, pointed toward the same conclusion, one that Jennifer Single SC articulated in the plain, direct language that the evidence required. Premeditated. That word, premeditated, carries a great deal of legal weight, and it is worth pausing to understand what it means in this context. It does not mean that Thijssen felt no emotion during the events of October 25. It means that the events of October 25 were not produced by emotion. They were produced by planning. The gap between the impulse and the act was filled not with hesitation or doubt, but with reconnaissance, with preparation, with the deliberate assembly of everything needed to carry out an act of violence in a controlled environment. Lilie James arrived at the gymnasium that evening at approximately 7 p.m., having come directly from a water polo session with students. She was moving through familiar territory, surrounded by the geography of a workplace she had committed to fully. She had no reason to examine the cleaning sign and understand it as anything other than what it appeared to be. She had no framework within which an ordinary notice outside a bathroom could be understood as something placed there by a man who had spent the preceding days walking through the same building, testing the weight of the door behind which she was about to stand. She walked toward the open door. She walked toward the one he had chosen. The CCTV footage of Lilie James arriving at the gymnasium on the evening of October 25th, 2023 shows a young woman moving through a familiar space with no apparent sign of distress. She had come from water polo, from the physical and purposeful work she loved, from the company of students she was genuinely invested in. She was doing what she had always done. She was showing up. She was smiling. That detail lands with a particular weight when held against everything that preceded it. The weeks of post-separation surveillance, the rental car and the 7 passes of her home, the fake account and the gaslighting, the birthday party and the hour outside in the car, the intimate photograph and the humiliation deployed as punishment. All of it had moved through her life in the weeks before this evening, and none of it had taken from her what was fundamentally and irreducibly hers, the quality that every person who knew Lilie James, in every context in which they knew her, describes in the same terms, regardless of where or how they knew her. She lit up the room. That is not a phrase deployed here for effect. It is the phrase that the people who loved her return to instinctively, again and again, because it is the most accurate description available of what it meant to be in the same space as Lilie James. The warmth was not a performance. The brightness was not constructed for an audience. It was the genuine, unguarded expression of a person who moved through the world with a particular openness, the kind that makes other people feel seen, feel welcome, feel more present in their own lives simply by virtue of proximity. She was 21 years old. She had a degree she was building toward, a coaching role she had made her own, a family that loved her in the unconditional and complete way that Peter and Jamie James clearly loved all of their children, and a life so full of actual, substantive connection that 5 weeks with Paul Thijssen occupied only the smallest fraction of the landscape that mattered to her. She walked toward the bathroom door. She did not look at the sign outside the adjacent bathroom and understand it as anything other than an ordinary notice. She did not look at the corridor around her and feel the presence of what was waiting. She moved through the gymnasium with the easy familiarity of someone at home in a space she had earned, and the CCTV footage that captured her arrival shows, in its final frames, a young woman walking toward a door. Bright, present, fully, completely alive. The timestamp read approximately 7 p.m. 11 minutes later. The timestamp recorded something else. At some point before 7:11 p.m. on October 25th, 2023, Paul Thijssen emerged from the staff room. He moved toward the gymnasium. He had the hammer. He had the full day behind him, the hardware store, the rental car, the hours of coaching, the careful maintenance of an ordinary professional exterior across an entire working day. And now the day had arrived at the point toward which it had always been directed. He moved through the building with a direction, certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going, because he had been there before. He reached the gymnasium bathroom. He stood outside the door for 2 minutes. 2 minutes is not a long time by the measure of an ordinary day. It is the duration of a short piece of music, the length of a phone call that accomplishes something minor, the time it takes for a kettle to boil. In almost any other context, 2 minutes outside a door is unremarkable, noticed by no one, meaning nothing at all. Outside that door, at 7:11 p.m. on October 25th, 2 minutes is a span of time that is very difficult to hold in the mind once its full meaning has been absorbed. 2 minutes is long enough to hear the sounds inside a room, long enough to register, with complete clarity, the presence of another person, long enough for every biological mechanism in a human being that is oriented toward the avoidance of catastrophic and irreversible action to make itself felt. 2 minutes is the duration of a choice being made, or more precisely of a choice already made being confirmed. The moment in which everything that followed could still have been walked away from. He did not walk away. He opened the door. Inside that bathroom on the evening of October 25th, 2023, Lilie James was struck more than 25 times. This account will not detail those blows in sequence, not because truth should be softened, or because the violence should be made more comfortable than it was, but because the specific mechanics of what occurred inside that bathroom are not where the meaning of this detail lives. The meaning lives in the number. The meaning lives in the word that Jennifer Single SC, counsel assisting at the coronial inquest, used in describing the nature and extent of the injuries sustained by Lilie James. Overkill. That word requires examination, because it is not simply a forensic descriptor applied mechanically to a clinical finding. It is a window into something that Tim Watson Munro's professional assessment addressed directly and with precision. Overkill, in the language of forensic pathology and criminal psychology, describes violence that continues past the point of physical necessity, past the point where the outcome has already been determined, into a territory that is no longer about the original act, but about something happening in the psychology of the person committing it, something the act alone is not sufficient to satisfy. What that territory is, in this case, is not difficult to identify once the full pattern of Paul Thijssen's behavior has been understood in its totality. Lilie James had said no. She had ended the relationship with the clarity and self-possession that had always characterized the way she navigated her life. She had continued living, fully, openly, warmly, in the same institution, in the same corridors, with the same completeness, as if the 5 weeks she had spent with Paul Thijssen were precisely what they were, a minor episode in a life that had far more important things in it. She had not been diminished by him. She had not been controlled. She had not been brought back into the architecture he had tried to build around her. She remained whole, and the wholeness of her continued existence, the visible, daily, undeniable fact of Lilie James moving through the world entirely undiminished, was the thing that the constructed self of Paul Thijssen could not absorb. What the number of blows describes in Tim Watson Munro's assessment is not the explosion of a man who lost control of himself in a moment of overwhelming emotion. It describes the act of a man for whom the violence was serving a psychological function that went beyond the ending of a life. A man who needed, at some fundamental level of his interior landscape, not simply to stop her, but to obliterate the thing that he could not tolerate, her completeness, her freedom, and her absolute refusal to be defined by his perception of her. The bathroom door closed. The building around it continued its Wednesday evening routines. Students, colleagues, the ordinary sounds of a school in its final hours of the working day. None of them knew what was happening on the other side of that door. None of them were able to know. He came out of the bathroom carrying Lilie James's phone. That detail should be allowed to sit before anything else is said about what followed. He had just ended the life of a 21-year-old woman inside a bathroom at her workplace. He came out of that bathroom, and one of the first things he did was take her phone, not call for help, not notify anyone. not do any of the things that a person in shock might reflexively do in the aftermath of something catastrophic and accidental. He took her phone, the phone she had carried with her that evening when she arrived at the gymnasium, smiling, present, fully alive. Using that phone, he sent a text message to her father, Jamie James. The message communicated a direction without an explanation. Do not ask why. Do not call. Come to the school. Come to pick up Paul Thijssen, not to find his daughter. To collect the man who had just killed her. Jamie James began trying to call Lilie. The calls went unanswered, one after another. Each attempt to reach her returned nothing. No voice, no response. The particular silence of a phone that is present but unreachable, that rings without being answered or cannot be answered at all. For a father who has just received an unexplained text message from his daughter's ex-boyfriend, instructing him to come to a school at night without asking questions. Each unanswered call is a step deeper into the specific, physical dread that parents describe as unlike any other fear they have ever experienced. The fear that arrives in the body before the mind has caught up. The certainty that forms in the chest before there is information available to confirm it. He kept trying. She did not answer. Criminologist Xanthi Mallet, whose analysis contributed substantially to the public understanding of Paul Thijssen's behavior in both the immediate aftermath and the broader pattern of the case, examined the act of retrieving Lilie's phone and sending those text messages in the context of everything that preceded it. What Mallet's analysis makes clear is that this was not the panicked, impulsive behavior of someone overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had just done. It was a continuation of the same organizing impulse that had driven every phase of his behavior since the breakup. Monitoring during the relationship was control of her movement. The rental car and the 7 passes of her home were control of his proximity to her. Her fake account was control of his access to her digital world. The cleaning sign placed in front of the bathroom door was control of the space in which she would find herself. And now, in the minutes after October 25th crossed the line that no act of surveillance or humiliation had yet crossed, the impulse was still control. He was managing the scene. He was directing the movements of the people around it. He was deciding who came to the school and when and in what order. He was using a dead woman's phone to do it. Jamie James drove towards St. Andrew's Cathedral School. He continued calling his daughter on the way. The calls went unanswered every time. Somewhere in that drive, in the accumulating silence of each attempt to reach her, the understanding that something had happened, the thing that the body knows before the mind will fully accept, was building into something that could no longer be managed or deferred. He reached the school, and the night that the James family had been moving toward, without any knowledge that they were moving toward it, arrived in full. Before this story moves forward, I need a moment of your time. If you have stayed with this, if what you are hearing is making you feel something you want to act on, share this video right now. Put it on your stories. Send it to someone you love. Post it wherever you have a platform. Lilie James deserves to be known beyond the circumstances of her death. This story deserves to reach anyone who might one day recognize the warning signs before it becomes too late to act on them. Subscribe if you have not already. Keep watching. This is not finished. At 8:47 p.m. on October 2005, 2023, Paul Thijssen arrived at Diamond Bay Reserve in Vaucluse. The drive from St. Andrew's Cathedral School to Diamond Bay Reserve is not a short one. It is the drive of a person moving toward a specific destination, through a city that did not yet know what had happened in a gymnasium bathroom. Sydney at night, moving past the windows of a rental car. Ordinary lights, ordinary streets, an ordinary Wednesday evening for everyone who was not Paul Thijssen, and not Jamie James, and not the investigators who would shortly be dispatched to a school on the edge of the city. At Diamond Bay Reserve, he disposed of the hammer. He placed it in a public bin. The choice of disposal method is, in its own way, revealing. not a drain pipe, not a body of water, not a location chosen for its inaccessibility. A public bin in a public reserve, the kind of bin that is emptied at some point by a council worker completing an ordinary shift. It is a disposal that speaks not to the operational sophistication of the hardware store visit and the cleaning sign, but to someone moving through the aftermath with a narrowed focus, not a strategic mind operating at full capacity, but a person managing one immediate task at a time. Get rid of the hammer. This is where the hammer goes. He left Diamond Bay Reserve and moved into the approximately 2 hours that the available evidence cannot fully account for. He was somewhere in the geography of Sydney's eastern harbour side. He was not at home, not in the company of anyone who knew him, not in a location that could later provide a witness to his state of mind. At some point during those hours, he went to the Gap. The Gap is a cliff-top location at the southern headland of Sydney Harbour, in Vaucluse. It carries a particular weight in the geography of this city, a location with its own documented history of people arriving at its edge at the worst moments of their lives, a place that has its own complex and painful significance independent of anything connected to this case. He left a backpack at the Gap. Inside it, an older phone and personal belongings, items that in their totality read as the arrangements of a person preparing for the possibility that they would not need those things again. His main phone, the device that would have carried the most complete record of his communications, his digital movements, the full architecture of his interactions across the entire period under investigation, was never recovered. In the sequence of calculated decisions that shaped the day of October 25 from its beginning, the permanent absence of that phone from the evidence is a detail that investigators noted with the attention it deserves. He stood at the cliff edge. He did not go over. He had one more thing to do first. At 11:45 p.m. on October 25, 2023, Paul Thijssen made a call. He dialed 000. The call, reconstructed from recordings and evidence presented at the coronial inquest, was quiet. His voice carried none of the emotional register that most people might expect from a person calling emergency services in the aftermath of extreme violence. No breathlessness, no evident distress, no fractured quality in the delivery of the information. It was quiet, and it was almost meek, in the specific way that a person sounds when they are relaying information they consider already processed. Someone who has moved through the worst of what has happened and arrived at the administrative task on the other side of it. He told the operator that there was a body at St. Andrew's Cathedral School. He provided the location within the school, the gymnasium, the bathroom. He said that someone should go in before morning. The call ended with a sentence that has been cited repeatedly in the coverage of this case because it contains within its 8 words a quality that resists easy accounting. I think someone should just go in there before people arrive in the morning. Thank you. Thank you. The thank you is the detail that most people who have followed this case return to when they try to articulate what it is about Paul Thijssen's behavior in the hours after October 25 that most defies ordinary comprehension. It is the word of a person completing a routine transaction, the word appended to an interaction that has been managed appropriately and is now, from the speaker's perspective, concluded. The word that a person says to a service worker, or to someone who answers a question, or to a colleague on the way out of a meeting. He said, "Thank you" to the 000 operator after reporting the location of the woman he had just killed. 3 minutes after the call ended, CCTV cameras at the Gap captured him there for the final time. He was at the edge. Whether the backpack and the older phone and the positioning at the cliff constituted a plan that the subsequent arrival of police interrupted, whether his survival of that night was the outcome of external intervention or of an internal decision made at the edge, whether those final 3 minutes contained anything that could be called remorse, none of those questions were answered with finality by the available evidence. What the evidence answers without ambiguity is the sequence that preceded the call. The hardware store in the morning, the rental car, the cleaning sign placed in front of a bathroom door, the 2 minutes standing outside that door, the hammer raised more than 25 times, the phone taken from Lilie James's pocket, the text sent to her father, the drive to Vorkus, the hammer disposed of in a public bin, and then, nearly 5 hours after, the gymnasium, a quiet voice at the end of an emergency line, providing information and ending the call with a courtesy. Tim Watson Munro's assessment identified this quality. The gap between the exterior composure and the interior reality maintained with consistency from the hardware store through to the 000 call, as the defining feature of Thijssen's psychological profile. Not a man who had broken down and rebuilt himself in the space of a single evening. A man whose performance of normalcy was so deeply embedded that it functioned even here, in the hours after the most extreme act of his life. Emergency services were already moving towards St. Andrew's Cathedral School. Police arrived at St. Andrew's Cathedral School just before midnight. The school that had educated Paul Thijssen as a 15-year-old student, that had welcomed him back as an assistant coach, and then as a full-time member of staff, that had provided Lilie James with the professional home she had built with care and genuine investment. That school was now a crime scene. The specific clinical presence of officers and forensic personnel moving through corridors that hours earlier had carried the ordinary sounds of a school in its evening hours. Inside the gymnasium bathroom, they found an unidentified woman in her early 20s. The scene, as described in the evidence later presented at the coronial inquest, was consistent with extreme violence. The injuries documented were consistent with multiple blows. The language used by investigators, and later by Jennifer Single SC in the examination of that evidence, was careful and deliberate. The language of people trained to describe what they have found accurately, without allowing the description to reduce the person it concerns to a catalogue of wounds. She was, in that first hour of documentation, an unidentified woman in her early 20s. She was someone. She was, though her identity had not yet been formally confirmed, Lilie James. The identification did not take long. The text messages sent from her phone to Jamie James were already in the possession of a family that was moving in real time through the specific collapse of understanding that begins when the information can no longer be deferred. Jamie James, who had driven to the school in response to a message that told him not to ask questions, had found something at St. Andrew's Cathedral School that confirmed what every unanswered call had already in his body told him. 11 kilometers away, at the gap in Vaucluse, the second crime scene was being established. Thijssen was located in the area. He was taken into police custody. The backpack was found. The older phone, the personal belongings arranged at the edge of a cliff by a man who had spent several hours between a murder scene and an emergency call standing at the edge of a drop above Sydney Harbour. His main phone was not found. It has never been recovered. The manhunt that the nature of the crime might otherwise have required did not unfold. He had not left the country. He had not constructed an effective disappearing act in the hours available to him. He was at the gap, and he was found. And the night that began with a hardware store visit ended with 2 separate police perimeters on opposite sides of Sydney, and a family standing on the edge of a grief that has no floor. As dawn came up over the city on October 26, 2023, the notifications began. The school, the university, the water polo community, the sports networks and the social circles and the overlapping landscapes that Lilie James had inhabited with such fullness. The language assembled by institutions for moments like this is never equal to what it is trying to carry. The inadequate, carefully worded phrases that attempt to name an absence that language was not built for. At the family home in Sans Souci, in the suburb that sat by the water, in the house where Lilie James had grown up spending her summers at the edge of the bay, Jamie James and Peter James were standing at the edge of something that no parent should ever have to look into. Their daughter had gone to work on a Wednesday evening. She had not come home, and the city that would, in the weeks and months that followed, learn her name and love her story and fight, publicly and with purpose, for the systemic changes her death demanded. That city had not yet, in those first hours, fully understood the weight of what October 25th, 2023 had taken from the world. It would. Australia did not receive the news quietly. The city woke on October 26th, 2023, with a specific quality of heaviness that settles over a place when the worst of what a community fears has been. Confirmed. The fragments had circulated through the night. A gymnasium, a school in the CBD, a woman in her early 20s, extreme violence. By the time the morning news cycles carried the full picture, the weight that had been gathering through those dark hours had nowhere left to go except outward. Premier Chris Minns made a public statement. He named the loss. He called for the conversations that a death of this kind demands. He did what political language is designed to do in these moments. It acknowledged the community's grief and placed it in the larger context of the national conversation about gendered violence that this case immediately and unmistakably joined. The flowers came first. They appeared outside St. Andrew's Cathedral School in the days following October 25th, arrangements carried there by people who had not met Lilie James, who had learned her name in the same news cycle where they learned she was gone. They appeared at the James family home in Sans Souci, at the gate of the house that sat by the water, in the suburb where Lilie had grown up spending her summers at the edge of the bay. They accumulated in the quiet, insistent way that flowers do when a community needs to make its grief visible, because every other available form of expression has already proved inadequate. On October 28, 2023, 3 days after the night that changed everything for her family, a candlelight vigil was held. People gathered in the oldest available human ritual for collective grief, standing in the dark together, holding small flames, in the presence of the shared loss of someone who had belonged to a community so fully that her absence registered in every corner of it. Most of those who gathered had no direct connection to Lilie James. They came because the story of who she was, assembled in fragments across those first days of news coverage, had made her real to them, and because the reality of her had made her death, and the manner of it, unbearable in the particular way that truth unbearably lands. A GoFundMe was established for the James family. Thousands of people contributed. A video began moving across social media platforms with the momentum that belongs to things that have arrived at precisely the right moment. It was footage of Lilie James on a stage at Danebank Anglican School, performing her HSC drama monologue. The text was Macbeth. She was extraordinary, fully committed to every line, bright with the specific aliveness that everyone who shared a space with her describes as the first and most lasting thing they remember about her. She performed Shakespeare without any knowledge of what would follow those years. She was simply present, inhabiting that stage completely, doing what she loved, in the place where some of the best chapters of her young life had unfolded. Hundreds of thousands of people watched that footage knowing what came after it. Watching a young woman on a stage, fully alive, required a kind of endurance most people had not been asked to exercise before. Counting Dead Women Australia recorded Lilie James as the 46th woman killed by gendered violence in Australia in 2023. 46. That number must be held, not processed and moved past, not cited and released. Each entry in that record is a complete life, a full person, with a history and a community, and a set of people who will carry the fact of their absence for every remaining year of their own lives. 46 women, 1 calendar year, 1 country. Lilie was the 46th, At 10:35 a.m. on October 26, 2023, Lilie James was formally identified. The identification made official what a father already knew, what a family had understood through the accumulated silence of every unanswered call, through the text sent from their daughter's phone by someone who was not their daughter, through the police who had arrived at the school in the night. The formal identification at 10:35 in the morning was the moment the bureaucratic machinery of loss caught up with the reality that the James family had been living inside since the previous evening. It confirmed the name. It placed the name in the record. It made the worst thing real in the only way that institutions know how to make things real. At 11:40 a.m. on the same morning, investigators identified Paul Thijssen from the school's CCTV footage. The footage placed him in the corridor. It placed him at the bathroom door. It placed him in the sequence of movements that the physical evidence and the forensic analysis of the scene had already reconstructed with clarity. The case had a confirmed victim. It had a confirmed perpetrator. What it did not yet have was certainty about where that perpetrator was. On October 27, 2023, tradesmen working in the area near Diamond Bay Reserve in Vaucluse spotted a body on the rocks below. A rescue team was deployed. A helicopter was involved in the recovery operation. The body was brought up from the rocks and taken for examination. Fingerprints were cross-referenced with records held by the Netherlands Embassy. Paul Thijssen, 23 years old, born in the Netherlands, sports coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School. The man who had walked into a hardware store on the morning of October 25th and left with a hammer. The murder-suicide was confirmed. There would be no trial, no courtroom, no dock, no formal proceedings in which evidence was laid out before a jury and examined by counsel and resolved in the public reckoning that the criminal justice system is designed to provide. There would be no moment in which a judge addressed a living man and named, with the full authority of the law, the nature and consequence of what he had done. The mechanism of formal criminal justice had been removed. The only forum left, the only institution still capable of examining the full truth of what happened and why, placing it on the public record, and making recommendations designed to prevent the next death, was a coronial inquest. The most disturbing thing about Paul Thijssen is not that he was a monster. Monsters occupy a useful cultural category. They are the exceptions, fundamentally categorically different from ordinary people, recognizable in their difference by a quality that marks them as outside the range of what normal human behavior produces. Calling a man a monster is, in its way, a reassurance. It says this is not what the rest of us are. This is not what the people around you are. What this man did belongs to a separate species of action that ordinary human communities do not generate, and ordinary human perception cannot be expected to detect. Paul Thijssen was visible. He was visible to colleagues who sat beside him at a dinner table and watched him open a phone to check a location indicator. They noticed it. They named it, to themselves and to each other, as too much. They did not name it as the early chapter of a pattern that had already produced violence in a previous relationship and would produce something far worse in the next one. They named it as too much, and then they continued the evening. And the word that would have been more accurate, the word that correctly identifies location monitoring of a partner without their active, ongoing consent, was not the word that was chosen. He was visible to a mutual acquaintance approached before a birthday party and asked to report back on Lilie's movements throughout the evening. He was visible to the family of a previous girlfriend who stood in a doorway and made a threat that was never acted on, never filed, never followed through to the point where a record existed. Look at the people around you, the relationships you can observe closely enough to notice when something registers as wrong. Have you ever been in that position? Watched a dynamic that made something in you go quiet and uncertain? Felt the specific discomfort of a situation you did not have the language to name? and reached instead for the interpretation that required the least from me. Most people have. Most people have done it more than once and never thought about it again. This case is built in part from the accumulated weight of exactly those moments. A culture that handed every bystander, in each instance of discomfort, a ready-made softer interpretation, devotion instead of surveillance, intensity instead of control, passion instead of obsession, and watched every bystander, in each instance, accept the offer. What changes when communities learn to refuse it? A coronial inquest is not a criminal trial. It cannot convict. It cannot sentence. It does not operate within the adversarial framework of a courtroom, and its findings do not carry the legal consequences of a jury verdict or a judicial ruling. What it can do, and what it exists precisely to do, is establish on the public record the full factual circumstances of a death, examine the systems and decisions that contributed to it, and issue formal recommendations aimed at preventing that same configuration of failures from producing the same outcome again. For Lilie James, it was the only trial her case would ever receive. The inquest was held in March 2025 before NSW State Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan. The proceedings were assisted by Jennifer Single SC, who led the examination of witnesses with a precision and moral weight that matched the gravity of the task she had been assigned. The evidence assembled across those proceedings: testimony, expert assessment, forensic records, CCTV footage, and documentary evidence drawn from the full history of Paul Thijssen's behavior, constituted the most complete public account of what happened and why that the absence of criminal proceedings had made necessary. Kate Seidler's testimony examined the interior landscape of a man whose exterior had been so carefully and consistently maintained that the institutions around him had never had adequate cause to look further. The fragility of the self-image Thijssen had constructed was not something visible from the outside, because the performance of competence and reliability he had delivered across every professional context he inhabited was not a partial performance. It was total. What lay beneath it? The dependency on control, the inability to absorb rejection, the violent response that had surfaced in the previous relationship and been absorbed without formal record, had never breached the surface of the professional identity he presented to St. Andrew's Cathedral School, or to anyone else who had employed or relied upon him. Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, whose expertise in domestic violence and gendered violence has shaped significant elements of national policy and public conversation on coercive control, placed the specific behaviors documented across the relationship and post-separation period in their precise academic and clinical context. The location monitoring, the fake Snapchat account, the co-opted mutual acquaintance at the birthday party, the intimate image shared without consent as an instrument of punishment. Each was examined as a component of a documented pattern, not a series of isolated failures of judgment that happened to occur in proximity to one another, but a coherent architecture of control with a clearly identifiable internal logic. Dr. Danny Sullivan delivered what was, across the full span of the proceedings, the most clinically direct testimony. His professional assessment of Thijssen's state of mind at the time of the attack contained no softening and required none. There was no mental disorder. The violence was not the product of a mind that had ceased to function within the boundaries of its own rational awareness. The hatred that drove the events of October 25, 2023 had been formed specifically and traceable from rejection. The punishment Thijssen had delivered inside that gymnasium bathroom had been chosen by a person in full possession of their faculties, who understood what they were doing and had decided in advance that it was what they intended to do. The CCTV footage was shown in court. The dry runs, the corridor, the cleaning sign, Lilie arriving at the gymnasium, the full visual record of the days leading up to and including October 2005, 2023. Jennifer Single SC addressed the court in the aftermath of that footage. The words she spoke have been cited in every major account of the inquest's proceedings and deserve to be cited again here, without embellishment, because they are already exactly what they need to be. No matter how many times you view that footage, it is not easy to watch. Her voice cracked as she said it. Peter and Jamie James attended every day of the coronial inquest. What that means, in practical terms, is that they sat in a courtroom and listened. They listened to testimony about the surveillance their daughter had been subjected to across the 5 weeks of the relationship and the period that followed the breakup. They listened to the evidence about the fake Snapchat account, the intimate photograph, the mutual acquaintance recruited to monitor her at a birthday party, the rental car and the 7 passes of her home. They listened to the forensic evidence. They were present for the CCTV footage. They sat with the full accumulation of everything that the investigation and the inquest had assembled about the weeks leading up to October 25th, 2023, and about the evening itself. They did not look away. The grace with which they conducted themselves throughout those proceedings, and throughout the entire public dimension of the period following their daughter's death, including the media, the advocacy work, and the sustained effort to ensure that Lily's death produced change in the systems that had failed to prevent it, is not something that can be easily accounted for. They had every right and every justification to move through the aftermath of October 25 in the language of pure rage. Every person who witnessed their story would have understood it. Not one person would have questioned it. They chose something harder. Betta James gave testimony to the court. Her words were delivered with the quiet force of someone who has moved through the kind of grief that reshapes everything and arrived on the other side of it not diminished, but carrying a purpose that the grief itself had generated. If we are not teaching boys how to accept and value a woman's opinions and choices and accept rejection, we may be setting them up for failure. Or, in our case, a moment of time we will never recover from. Those words require no commentary. They are reproduced in full and allowed to occupy the space they have earned. Jamie James spoke outside the court, to the cameras and reporters, and through them to every person who had been following the case closely enough to be waiting for what he had to say. His sentence was 8 words. Please, start that conversation. Not remember her, not hold him accountable. The distilled request of a father who had looked at the complete landscape of what happened to his daughter and identified with extraordinary clarity the single intervention most likely to protect the next young woman from the next man whose warning signs went unnamed for long enough to become fatal. Start the conversation. On November 27th, 2025, NSW State Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan delivered the formal findings of the coronial inquest into the death of Lilie James. She spoke in the language of precision and institutional responsibility, the language of a person who has examined a complete factual record and is now required to name what it shows, without qualification, without the softening that formal public language sometimes performs when the truth it is carrying is too heavy for ordinary delivery. Her findings confirmed what the evidence had always, from the beginning, supported. The death of Lilie James was premeditated. It was calculated. It was not a momentary loss of control by a man overwhelmed by emotion in a situation that escalated past the point of his ability to manage it. It was a deliberate act, planned across multiple days, executed with the specific preparation that the CCTV dry runs, the cleaning sign, the hardware store receipt, and the rental car collectively and unambiguously documented. It occurred in the context of domestic violence. It occurred in the context of gendered violence. Those two contexts were not incidental to what happened. They were the environment in which it was made possible. O'Sullivan's recommendations addressed, with equal precision, the systemic conditions that the inquest had identified as contributors to that environment. They called for better education for people aged 16 to 24, the period in which the cultural framing of control as care is most actively established and most resistant to correction. They called for greater public literacy around coercive control, for the language of accurate identification to become common enough in ordinary community life that people are equipped to use it before a situation has moved past the point where naming it can still change the outcome. She called for urgent action on technology-facilitated abuse, the tools through which coercive control now operates with a speed, invisibility, and reach that legislation had not kept pace with. She placed a direct and specific obligation on media to stop describing intimate partner killers as acting out of character before the full facts of a case have been established. That framing, replicated across dozens of cases and dozens of news cycles, actively shapes public understanding in ways that make accurate identification harder to reach. The inquest had examined more than 550 domestic violence homicides recorded in New South Wales between 2000 and 2022. Within that entire dataset, Lilie James and Paul Thijssen represented the youngest intimate partner homicide-suicide on record. O'Sullivan's findings closed with a declaration that placed the full weight of this case in its correct context. Lilie's death is not an isolated tragedy. It is part of a devastating pattern of violence against women which requires urgent and sustained action. There is one word that appears with more consistency than any other across the expert testimony presented at the coronial inquest, across the academic literature cited by Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, across the media coverage, across the conversations that the case generated in every public forum in which it was discussed. The word is normalized. It is not a dramatic word. It does not carry the emotional force of words like violence or terror or predator. It is a quiet word, a clinical word, the word that describes the process by which behavior that should register as a warning is absorbed instead into the category of ordinary and filed under the heading of how things are, rather than the heading of something that requires a response. What the inquest assembled, part by part across its proceedings, was a complete catalogue of the things that had been normalized in the landscape around Paul Thijssen. Friends had sat at a table and watched him check a location indicator on his phone, watched him open an application designed to show him the real-time geographic position of a partner who had not, in any evident way, been asked whether their location was available to be checked at. Any moment, in any company, without notice, they saw it. They named it in the private language of people processing something that has unsettled them without quite crossing the threshold of formal concern. They called it intense. They said he was a lot. They filed it under too much. Not under a word that carries a response attached to it. Under a word that permits the evening to continue. A mutual acquaintance received a request before a birthday party. The request was framed in the familiar language of ordinary social concern. Keep an eye on her, let me know how she seems. The full architecture of what was being asked. That this person become an instrument of a post-separation surveillance operation directed at a woman who had chosen to end a relationship and was being monitored in the execution of that choice, was not disclosed. The acquaintance complied without fully understanding the role they had been assigned. The father of a previous girlfriend stood in a doorway. He told Thijssen to leave. He said he would call the police. The police were not called. No record was created. No formal process was initiated that would have followed Thijssen from that doorway into every subsequent professional context he entered. He walked away from that house and into a coaching role at an independent school, and the warning that had been issued in that doorway dissolved into nothing because the step that would have made it matter, the formal act of following through, was not taken. Every person who occupied the landscape around Paul Thijssen had a moment. Every institution, every bystander, every friend, every system had a point at which the information available was sufficient, if correctly named, to have produced a different outcome. In each of those moments, the charitable interpretation was chosen over the accurate one. This is not a story with a hidden truth that only becomes available after the ending has been reached. There is no revelation requiring information that was unavailable before. There was no secret. There was no darkness accessible only through hindsight's particular light. The warning was present throughout, at every stage, in every chapter. It was present in the location sharing demands during the 5 weeks of the relationship. It was present in the tree punched near a woman's head when she refused him. It was present in the forged documents through which he had constructed a professional identity designed to pass unexamined. It was present in the fake Snapchat account, in the gaslighting that followed its discovery, in the intimate photograph shared without consent as a deliberate instrument of punishment. It was present in the CCTV footage of a man walking through a school gymnasium in the days before October 25th, 2023, memorizing the weight of a door. The signs were never missing. They were simply never called by their correct names. On November 17th, 2023, Lilie James was farewelled at Danebank Anglican School, the school where she had delivered the Macbeth monologue, where she had built the friendships that became central to everything that followed, where the years that shaped her had unfolded. It was a homecoming of the worst kind. On November 3rd, 2023, the gymnasium bathroom at St. Andrew's Cathedral School was demolished, structurally removed. The school's library was converted into a counseling center, a space created from grief because grief had arrived in a volume that required a dedicated place to go. The building that had contained the last minutes of Lilie James's life was dismantled, and what remained in its place was a space for the people still living to begin the long, unfinished work of recovery. Her name is on the Counting Dead Women Australia list. Entry 46, 2023. Brief, clinical. The compressed notation of an administrative record. It carries nothing of the laugh that moved across every room she entered and made people feel, instinctively and immediately, that they had been welcomed. Nothing of the Shakespeare delivered with total commitment to an audience of classmates at 17. Nothing of the students who arrived uncertain at water polo training and left having discovered that they loved the sport because of the particular quality of attention she brought to teaching them. Nothing of the parents who have refused, in every available public context, to allow their daughter to exist only in the terms of the night she was killed. Lilie James's story does not end in that bathroom. It continues in every policy recommendation that carries her name forward into the institutions designed to protect the people who come after her. In every conversation started because Jamie James stood outside a courtroom and asked for it. In every young person who watches this video and gains the language to name what they are seeing before the naming arrives too late to change what happens next. In every young woman who says no and is heard and remains whole. If you have stayed with this story, if you have sat with Lilie James through all of it, and you want what you are feeling right now to become something more than a feeling, here is what you can do. Share this video, not for the channel, for Lilie, for the 45 women whose names appeared on that list before hers, for every person in your community who is currently inside a dynamic that has not yet been called by its correct name, and who needs someone in their life to have already learned what the correct name is. The wider this story travels, the greater the chance that it reaches the person who needs to hear it before they are standing in the position that Jamie and Peter James have occupied every day since October 26th, 2023. Like the video. Subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. This channel exists for exactly this work. Stories that carry real weight, delivered with the seriousness the people inside them deserve. Drop a comment. Write the name of someone you want this to reach. Or simply write her name, Lilie James. Let the comment section become a record of every person who heard this story and made the choice to carry it forward. She was 21 years old. She was bright and present and full of a life that had barely begun to show what it was going to become. She went to work on a Wednesday evening at a school she knew well, in a role she had built with care, and she did not come home. The systems around her were not equal to what was coming for her. The culture around her had not yet developed the common language required to name what was visible in plain sight. That language is being built. The systems are being changed. The conversations are being started. Because of two parents who attended every day of an inquest they should never have needed to attend. Because of a young woman on a stage at 17, performing Shakespeare with everything she had. Because naming what we see, before silence becomes irreversible, is the one thing that changes what comes next. Start that conversation.